Everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our lecture on chapter 5, measurement concepts. In part 1 of our lecture, we talked about different scales of measurement as well as looking at the different types of reliability. And in the second half of the lecture, I want to really focus on validity, so another measurement concept that's particularly important in assessment. So validity is the extent to which meaningful inferences can be drawn about a particular construct that may be made from an assessment. So, validity is really saying how much we can say our assessment measures what we actually want it to measure. And what we actually want it to measure is some construct. So, whether or not our assessment actually measures someone's risk for engaging in alcohol misuse or experiencing depressive symptoms, the constructs are alcohol misuse and depression. And validity is how much we can say that our assessment actually measures that thing. Validity is related to reliability in the sense that reliability is necessary but not sufficient condition for validity. So, in other words, it is possible for test scorers to have a high reliability score with little or no validity for a particular purpose. But the inverse isn't true. In order for a test to have good validity, it must have high reliability. So the way that I like to think about this and the way that your book and maybe other textbooks have taught you this is to think about it as a bullseye metaphor, as like a dartboard. So say the bullseye or the center of your dartboard is the construct that you're trying to measure. The more times that you hit the bullseye, the more consistent you are, that is considered higher reliability. The closer together your darts are to one another, the higher or greater reliability you have. However, if the bullseye is not the right construct or is representing the construct insufficiently or inaccurately, your reliability is meaningless for the test's purpose. So maybe your darts are all still together, but instead of being on the bullseye, they're on the triple 20, which is different than what we're actually trying to measure because it's not the construct. So in order for a test to be valid, those darts all have to be together and they all have to be measuring the same thing, which is our validity. So that's where we get into how reliability is a precursor to validity, but it's not sufficient in itself. You have to have both reliability and validity to say that you are measuring your construct. And although validity coefficients of 0.1 and 0.2 can be considered good in some cases, most validity coefficients tend to be closer to 0.6 for us to be considered that they're pretty strong. And validity is just one half because we also have what we call invalidity. And invalidity can occur in a couple of different ways. Sometimes it occurs when an assessment fails to fully measure the right construct that we're interested in, and we call this particular type of invalidity construct underrepresentation. But we can also have invalidity when an assessment measures the wrong construct altogether, and we call this construct irrelevant variance. Similar to reliability, there are different types of validities. And those include face validity, content validity, criterion related, construct, and treatment validity. It's helpful to keep in mind that content and criterion related validity can be considered to be subsumed under the umbrella of construct validity. So construct validity is this larger umbrella, and under that umbrella, content and criterion validity are there. One type of validity that you have probably heard of before is face validity, and it's actually not considered a real type of validity. So, regardless of the fact that face validity isn't a real type of validity, face validity refers to whether an assessment looks like it's measuring what it's supposed to measure. So, if you are having someone take an assessment of depression, the items look like they're measuring depression. So they're asking someone if they've been sad for 2 weeks or more days than not in that time frame. Like it looks like it's measuring depression, but it's not an actual type of validity because we're not actually measuring anything. So let's go into a little bit more detail on the other types of validity that we have listed here. So content validity refers to the representativeness of items from a population of items. So content validity is typically established by a panel of judges or people that we call subject matter experts and is evaluated as the extent to which particular items assess a domain area. So if you are interested in assessing depression, you're wanting to develop an assessment to do that, to establish content validity, you create a list of items that you think measure depression. Then you would give your assessment or your items to these expert judges or subject matter experts, and you would ask them to give you feedback on whether or not your items, your population of items, is truly capturing the entire construct of depression. And it's these subject matter experts that will give you the ways to strengthen your content validity. So, specifically, the better your subject matter expert or your judge, the more versed they are in your construct, the more they can tell you whether or not you have covered the entirety of that construct, which can then strengthen your validity, your content validity specifically. We also have criterion-related validity, which refers to the extent to which test scores compare to performance on a criterion measure. So the criterion measure can be an assessment tool, another assessment tool, or some external criteria, such as like grades, a diagnosis, or job satisfaction. Criteria related validity can correspond to a criterion measured at the same time, or it can be measured at a different time. When the criterion is measured at the same time, we call this concurrent validity. So you're saying, I'm measuring how you score on this type of validity or on this specific construct, and I'm going to give you another assessment that's also said to measure the same construct, and I'm going to see how comparable your scores are. This is concurrent validity, to say both of these things are measured at the same time. You also have predictive validity. And predictive validity is what we use when we are trying to make an estimate of a prediction about someone's performance at a later date based on their scores. So let me go through an example to help break this down. So an example of concurrent validity could be if you have a test of mechanical aptitude, you might give this test to a group of working mechanics or machinists. And then the ratings that they receive by their supervisor might be examined to determine whether the mechanical aptitude scores that they got on their assessment are related to their current work as discovered through the supervisor ratings. So it's concurrent because you're measuring them at the same time. You're having the machinists take the aptitude test at the same time that you're getting reports from their supervisor, and you're looking at how well does their score on the aptitude test match what they're actually doing. This is a concurrent validity, which is a specific type of criterion-related validity. An example of predictive validity might say that you have a bunch of students in high school who take a scholastic aptitude test that's designed to present or predict how well they're going to do in college. So things like the ACT or the SATs. And then you are going to look at the grades the students earn in college later on, because you have them take the test while they're in high school. And then you look at their grades in college and you look to see if their scholastic aptitude tests when they were in high school predicted how well they would do in school when they graduated from college. This is predictive validity. So looking at how well someone does on this specific measure and how well it predicts some outcome that we're looking at. And it's important to keep in mind that criterion-related validity can be reduced when you involve things like a restriction of range, which we're going to talk about next. So restriction of range can lower a test's predictive validity because it reduces the range of scores on a test or a criterion in some way. So restriction of range occurs often if you are giving a test and you eliminate people who have low scores. So think about this in the context of school. If you give a test to a class and you're trying to look at how valid the test is, you can only do that if you include everyone's scores. But if you restrict the range and say, I'm only going to look at how valid the test is for people who scored 80 or higher, 80% or higher on a test, you are restricting the range, making the range much narrower, which reduces the validity coefficient for that test. Another concept of predictive validity that can be problematic is what we call base rates. And base rates are the proportion of a population that represents that characteristic. And that can then influence our validity. So if the base rates of a characteristic being measured are really high or really low, it's difficult for us to be able to make predictions about that characteristic using a particular assessment. So, a good example of this is that if almost every single student is admitted into a medical school graduates, then the scores on someone's MCAT are unlikely to differentiate between those people who will graduate and those who don't. So, if you have a really high base rate in this case, everyone who gets into medical school will graduate, then how well they do on the entrance exam to a medical school, which is the MCAT, is going to be irrelevant in being able to predict who will graduate or not because it's a high base rate. The inverse can also be true with low base rates. If you have a low percentage of people who are going to achieve some characteristic, your validity is going to be lower because it's going to be hard to differentiate those people who will get that characteristic and who will not. There's also the concept of incremental validity, which refers to the extent to which a particular assessment instrument adds to the accuracy of predictions obtained from other tests or other less extensive measures of an assessment. So the more accurately and sensitively an assessment measures a construct, the more incremental validity or added value information that tool possesses. So the way that I like to think about this is that each assessment will add a little bit more to the way that we understand a concept or a construct of interest, but we have to specifically measure how much validity it adds. How much value added information are we gaining with the addition of that assessment? And as assessors and as counselors, we really have to take incremental validity into account when deciding whether or not we should use an additional assessment instrument, because there's a financial cost that comes with adding an assessment, even if it means acquiring more data to how we're understanding our client. We really have to decide if the cost and of the time to add that assessment in will give us more value added information, and we have to use our clinical sort of intuition to make that judgment of the clinical utility for that new information. So, with regards to criterion-related validity, we oftentimes have additional concepts that come into play. And within criterion-related validity, cutoff scores or thresholds can oftentimes be used for judging the presence of a characteristic, which can create this sort of either or type of decision making with assessments. So you might be saying that in order for us to say that someone experiences depression, they have to score this high on an assessment. Anything above this means that they are going to say, yes, you're experiencing depression, and anything below this means that you're not experiencing depression. So it creates this either or type of situation when we have these cutoff scores. And within those cutoff scores, we get outcomes that might not be what we're looking for. And one of those is what we call a false negative. So if a cutoff score on assessment is too low, assuming that those low scores equate to less of that characteristic, the chance of a false negative is higher. A false negative prediction means that we are incorrectly saying that someone has that characteristic when in reality they do not have that characteristic. So we're setting our cutoff point too low, and too many people who don't actually have whatever characteristic we're measuring. We keep using the depression example, so we'll say that. If we say the cutoff score is 5 out of 15, anyone who scores above 5, they're experiencing depression. If that is too low, we're going to experience a false negative, and that we are going to falsely predict that someone has depression when they don't. We can also have the inverse, which is what we call a false positive. And this occurs when our cutoff score is too high, again, assuming that high scores mean more of the characteristic that we're measuring. And when that happens, the chance of a false positive is higher. False positive predictions mean that it's hard to say when someone has a characteristic, so we estimate that they don't have it based on their score, even though they likely have that characteristic by construct. So, same measure, we're saying, okay, now the cutoff score is 12 out of 15 on this depression inventory. So, in order for us to say that someone has depression, they have to have a score of 12 or higher. And because that 12 is so high, 12 out of 15, we could have a considerable amount of people who actually meet the definition of depression by DSM criteria. But on our assessment measure, our cutoff point is too high and we're getting false positives. We're getting people who actually have the diagnosis but are not meeting the qualifications by the cutoff score because it's set too high. Two additional terms that come to mind are specificity and sensitivity, which are important for minimizing false negatives and false positives. Sensitivity refers to the accuracy of a cutoff score in detecting those people who belong to a particular category. So by definition, testing procedures that are sensitive produce few false negatives because we're actually saying we want to particularly detect those who have our construct or have our characteristic. Specificity, on the other hand, indicates the accuracy of a cutoff score in excluding those people who don't have that condition. So testing procedures that possess specificity yield few false positives because they're specifically eliminating the times where we say people who don't have that condition are actually being left out. Generally, if sensitivity is increased, specificity will be reduced and vice versa. So they're inversely or negatively correlated with one another. As one increases, the other decreases. So when you're talking about assessments, this particular type of predictive validity is really all about balancing your specificity and your sensitivity. We also have construct validity, which refers to the degree to which there is a theoretical basis for a test. So there are two specific types of construct validity: convergent validity and discriminant validity. And within construct validity, we oftentimes use factor analysis to establish evidence for our construct validity. So a full description of factor analysis is a little bit beyond the concept of this class, but what factor analysis is doing is looking at whether or not the items on our test are grouping together to create a factor that measures our assessment. So a really good example of this is the Big Five personality inventory, which measures extroversion, conscientiousness, openness to experience, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Each of those traits is a factor. And within each of those factors, on the Big Five personality inventory, there are a list of questions that are measuring that factor. And all of those factors combine to measure personality, which is our construct. So that's an example of factor analysis, is looking at the ways that our items group together to create factors that measure our construct. And we use this in construct validity because construct validity is looking at whether or not our assessment is actually measuring the construct that we're interested in. So convergent validity is one type of construct validity. And convergent validity is established when you have two tests measuring constructs that are theorized to be similar to one another, and you would expect them to be highly correlated with one another. That would give us a form of convergent validity. So for example, if you are looking at mathematical abilities, you might have your participants take a mathematical aptitude and also look at their grades in their mathematic courses. And you would expect those two things to be positively correlated with one another and pretty strongly correlated with one another. That would give us convergent validity on our measure of mathematical aptitude. We also have discriminant validity. And discriminant validity refers to detecting a negative relationship between constructs that we would expect are not related to one another. Theoretically, they are dissimilar. So, using our same example, if we have a test of mathematical ability, it probably shouldn't show a strong correlation with a test of clerical speed and accuracy because they're completely different. How fast you can type and how well you can add, subtract, multiply, and divide are theoretically different from one another, so they shouldn't be related. They should be a negative correlation, or at the very least, a weak correlation. And we also have what is called treatment validity. And treatment validity refers to the use of an assessment tool as an intervention within itself in the counseling setting. So, if the results of a test are useful by making a difference in the counseling process, we would say that that test has treatment validity. And research indicates that the assessment process itself, particularly paying attention, or particularly the attention during test interpretation, can foster positive outcomes within clients. If you go over assessment results with your clients and you interpret the results for the client is more likely to make significant progress in the direction of the construct that's being measured. So this is what we call treatment validity. It's using the assessment as an intervention in counseling to improve the client's outcomes towards their goal. So within the context of assessment, we've talked about different types of validity. But when we actually get into the implementation of assessments, you're going to see the term validity scales come up. And validity scales are useful elements within assessments for detecting any issues that could occur with validity, specifically around particular types of response sets or the ways that participants respond to the questions on an assessment measure. So, different assessments will have different validity scales, but they're pretty common in more advanced assessments. So things like the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, has an entire list of validity scales that are all used to measure any ways that a participant's responses to the answers could be an issue with their validity. So our book goes into a really deep dive into what those are, and you're welcome to look into those, but I have just a couple of examples in here. So some validity skills that show up in other assessments are faking bad. So when someone is changing their answers on an assessment to make their presenting concern look worse than what it actually is. We also have validity skills that are for looking at faking good. So where people are looking for social desirability, they're saying that they are not experiencing these things because they want to look good in the eyes of the assessor. We can also have assessments that are looking for like random responses. Does the person look like they're lying? Are they infrequently answering questions? Do they look like they are giving more effort in the first half of the study or the first half of the assessment from the second half of the assessment? All of these validity scales are built into specific assessments. Not all assessments have validity scales, but when they are there, it's important to pay attention to them in the context of assessment because it provides us with information around whether or not we can trust that our assessment is actually measuring the thing that we want it to based on how our participant responded to the questions. So you might be asking yourself, like, what do we do with this information? We have reliability, we have validity. What does it actually mean in the context of assessment? And really, we talk about validity and reliability in the context of assessment development. Because in order for us to develop a sound assessment, you have to have good reliability and good validity of that construct. But then how do you assess, or how do you develop an assessment? This is a little bit beyond the scope of our course, but our book talks about it, and I think it's really interesting to think about all the things that go into the development of an assessment, so I just want to go over that with you. Because developing a sound assessment involves several steps. You oftentimes start in the beginning by writing several different assessment items that are clear, concise, culturally relevant, or culture free, and are related to our concept or characteristic of interest. You're going to write down as many items as you can. Make sure that they are clear, concise, they make sense, and that they are eliminating or reducing cultural bias. Then you are going to pilot those items in a sample of people that are similar to the targeted group that you're hoping your assessment will be used for. So, if you want to use your assessment with people who are in an inpatient hospital setting, you're going to pilot your assessment with people in hospital settings. Might not be the exact hospital that you're looking at, but you're going to pilot in a similar hospital. After you've piloted a test, you're then going to create estimates of reliability and validity to make sure that your test is consistent and that it is measuring the thing that you need it to measure. And from that, your reliability and validity, you're going to make revisions to your scale. You're going to see if you can reduce items, if you can add items, what you should do to make sure that it is reliable and it is valid. And once you've established that reliability and validity, you're going to create a scoring system. So, a way to score your assessment so that it can be used. And then only after that point can you then start using your assessment in other samples and continue refining it in the future. So, every time it's being used, you're looking at whether or not you need to make changes to it. So, assessment and the development of our assessments is actually quite extensive and it takes a long time if you're going through all of these steps and you're doing your due diligence. But the only way that we get there is by understanding concepts like reliability and validity. So that is going to wrap up our lecture on chapter 5. As always, here are the review questions to help you study for this chapter so that you know that you're gathering the main concepts of this chapter. And I will see you all in the next lecture.